Good evening, good evening, good evening. Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. WeatherBrains episode number 789. It is the pre-show. This is for Monday, the 1st of March. Could it be? Meteorological spring is here. Wow. Well, welcome. This is the time of the show where we do three things. We share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and occasionally we say really outrageous things. So what we're going to do is get the guest on here a little late tonight. We're 3 minutes technically before showtime, but that's okay. We're going to make this puppy fly. So we're getting the embed code lined up, and we're going to get our guests on here and get this thing going. All right, let's invite. I know that Troy is still out. Troy's been through a rough time down in Austin with the deep freeze and the power and the water problems and everything else. It has been a rough ride, but we'll hope to get him back sooner than later, if not next week, the week after that in mid-March. Okay, I think we're good to go. So everybody's been invited. So just magically, the world's going to start to show up here in just a little bit. And hey, we're back in Studio A this week instead of Studio S, which means that the show can go on all night. When I'm in Studio S, I have to use this equipment to do television. But when I'm in Studio A, I don't. I can just walk into a studio and use their equipment. So just let this thing run all night, and should be a good shoe. And that we've got Neil Jacobs coming on tonight. This will be a lot of fun. He's a great guest, really smart guy. And everybody's griping, saying, hey, I haven't received an invitation in the email yet. Well, that's because I'm late. Sometimes you're just late. Bill, you ever been late? You ever been tardy?
Just a few times.
No, it's 7:59. I made it here with 45 seconds to spare. So I'm back in Studio A, so you guys can talk all night.
Well, this may be the night we need to do it.
Yeah, no hard out. So
because I've got just this much information, James.
Wow.
That
Is
much.
It War and Peace?
Yeah, this man's worth about 3 shows, I think.
He is.
There
Dr.
he is.
Jacobs. Yes.
How are you?
This is going to be a great show.
I told him you're worth 3 shows.
I'm excited about this.
We're going to cram 3 shows into one.
I've got so many stories. I could probably spend the rest of the year telling them.
Oh yeah.
There we go.
It's going to be good. And Aubrey, we haven't done email in like 2 years, so we promise we'll do it. See, we can do an email segment tonight because we're not on a hard out, so this is good.
We could be going till midnight.
Hi guys.
Hey, Aubrey.
And
I drove through your Fairtown last week.
You did, and you didn't call me.
I was in a rush to get home. That football stadium's awfully close to the interstate.
Yes, it is. It's a bit of a nightmare when they do the games.
James Madison University.
All right, well, let's get this thing started. Jen, you okay?
I'm good. Good to see y'all.
Okay. Kim should be on here. She typically picks up here and within the next 5 minutes. I know that Nate is out and Troy. Goodness gracious. I mean, I feel like we should be doing something to help him.
I know. Like, let's pack up the car and go put up some drywall or something.
Yeah, I mean, goodness gracious. The water damage is the absolute worst. But anyway, let's get the recorders going here. We'll miss the good stuff. All right, track 1, track 2, and here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. WeatherBrains episode number 789, the weekly show all about weather. This is for Monday, the 1st of March, the very first day of meteorological spring. And yet for some of us, it still feels like meteorological winter, but that's the way it works sometimes in March. Let's see here. Aubrey, good to see you. What's happening up in Harrisonburg, Virginia,
Good
the
to see you
lovely
guys.
Shenandoah Valley?
The beautiful Shenandoah Valley. So I realized today that this is my first 7-day without snow since the week of January 18th. So I am ecstatic just to make it to March. I've hibernated the last 2 weekends, just trying to breathe.
It's been rough for a lot of our folks. And again, we should mention Troy is going to be out tonight, and he probably will be out next week. We hope to have him back in mid-March, but he suffered severe water damage at his place, and that is just. I went through that one time, and it's an absolute nightmare. So we are hoping that Troy gets back up and running here soon. But his equipment's okay. But it's just that water damage, it is so complex and so complicated and takes so long. Jen, you ever had water damage to your place?
Not to that extent. Little spots here or there, but nothing that major. It's just, I feel so horrible. I wish we could do something more for him, but it's a long recovery. It's tough.
Well, when he comes back on the show, we just ought to give him an hour just to tell the story.
Absolutely.
Of the Texas deep freeze and everything that went wrong, and goodness, that's a whole show in itself. But he was right in the middle of it. Kim, I see you. I see your smiling face. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We're sitting a little bit better just north of Texas here in Oklahoma. It's been a little bit surreal to watch the continued catastrophe down there and to know that I'm so close to it. I have family down in Texas, so we've been watching them and standing by ready to help. They've had varying degrees of having water, not having water, having power, not having power. And it's the Houston metro area. You don't expect, well, I guess Houston, you kind of expect to live that way now. That poor city has just been raked by disaster after disaster, but this was a new one by them, certainly. So yeah, how can I complain about anything when there are people in our part of the world facing that? I
just hope that Houston doesn't have to deal with a hurricane this season. I mean, goodness gracious. Yeah, that's the last thing they need. So, but anyway, Bill Murray, let's bring in our guest. This is going to be a great show. This will be a really good show tonight.
Yeah, James, I'm really excited about tonight's guest WeatherBrain. And I'm so smart that I added all of my questions to the repository, but I didn't realize that I had not put my bio over there. So this is a man that needs no introduction. Dr. Neil Jacobs, of course, is most recent NOAA administrator and a really smart guy. And we're really thrilled to have him on the show tonight. So welcome to the show, Neil.
Thanks for having me. And it's a thrill to be back. I'm so excited to come and hang out and chat about weather and tell stories about some interesting and good times.
But Kim's a sucker for stories. She likes stories. So, and we all are. You're an awfully smart guy. Talk about your young days for a moment, because I went back and pulled up, 1979, I sent my science project to the science fair and it went to the International Science Fair. And I went back and found that old bulletin of the AMS article, where they wrote it up. And I look like I'm about 12 years old. And I just thought, if my science project went to the International Science Fair, where would Neil Jacobs' science project have gone?
Well,
to the Galaxy Science Fair or what? Because, you did some amazing stuff by the time you got to college. What was high school like?
It was I'm embarrassed to say I almost flunked out of high school because of unexcused absences, because I spent so much time playing hooky and surfing. But I got 5s on most of my AP exams. So I had college credit, but almost didn't get high school credit.
Wow.
And
so hence, is that a surfboard back there in the corner?
I'm in my apartment in DC. I've got 3 here they're not getting used enough. And it's crazy to say I should have all the free time in the world because I don't even have a job right now.
So you got your resume out on Indeed, Monster, what, Glassdoor?
I'm not on LinkedIn. I'm not, detest social media altogether. And so people can't figure out how to find me. It's kind of funny. I don't even think my NOAA email's been turned off. So if you're out there and you're sending stuff to my NOAA email and you don't reply, I'm sorry, I can't check it. But yeah, so that, I was never particularly good at English because I was dyslexic, but no one really identified it for a long time. And so I was put in all sorts of weird like classes for learning disabled people because they didn't understand it. But on like I took like a PSAT and all these standardized tests, I'd score really high in math. And so finally they put me in advanced classes and I excelled in obviously math, physics, and chemistry, but it was never really good in English. So I ended up, I grew up, my dad was in the Air Force. He was a fighter pilot and my mom was a high school history teacher. And so every couple of years we would move around. I lived overseas and his last station was down at Homestead Air Force Base in Miami. And he decided to retire and move up to Charleston, South Carolina, and they wanted to move away from hurricanes. And this was before Andrew, and of course, growing up in Miami, you think, oh, you're a hardened hurricane veteran. And so we moved up to Charleston right before Hugo hit.
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that we didn't realize was that in South Florida, you don't have all these pine trees everywhere. And it was the tree damage that was such a catastrophe there. I mean, we had 14 trees go down in the yard and 2 through the roof. And of course, we stayed because we thought, we're from Miami, we'll be fine. And I remember spending 3 weeks with no power and trying to chainsaw out of our driveway just to figure out how to go get water and stuff. And it was pretty scary. But so I finished out high school in South Carolina in Charleston and went to University of South Carolina on a debate scholarship. And I started doing speech and debate to kind of overcome my fear of public speaking and the dyslexia, which even was a challenge. When I'd go to NOAA, people would want to write speeches for me. And I was like, I got to write the stuff myself, or I would just write like a list of points and just rip off the whole thing because I couldn't really read stuff without it sounding super awkward. Which drove anyone who's trying to proofread anything I'm going to say publicly crazy because they couldn't, because I would just go out and just say stuff. But went to University of South Carolina and majored in math and physics, largely because I wasn't really good at anything else. And sort of really didn't know what I wanted to do. I was studying condensed matter, semiconductor stuff. And it was in a basement of a lab and I hated it, but I was spending all my free time surfing and fishing, and had a lot of odd jobs at the time. I worked as a bike mechanic, a cook, worked a fryer at Ryan's Steakhouse outside of James Island. It was interesting. And so how I ended up finding my way into the weather world, I was a couple of different odd jobs I had. I was working as a recreational fish guide down there, fly fishing for redfish in the salt marshes was a big thing. And I was also doing a lot of fiberglass repair and electronic work, and ended up doing some boat repair. And then some of the folks I was working with were also doing some electronic instrument installation and some other things on this ship called the Ron Brown, which is a NOAA vessel that was stationed down there. This is in the late 90s. And so I did a little work there and ran into this guy, Lynn Pietrafesa, who was a professor at North Carolina State. And, I don't know what would possess someone to go to a boat mechanic and be like, hey, you should go to grad school and study atmospheric science. But I thought, okay. So I went to NC State and studied air-sea interaction under him and Sethu Raman. And stuck around there and did a PhD. So when I was at NC State, this was late 90s, early 2000s. And I stayed there for a PhD. So I was there sort of on the heels of when Joe Cione, Chris Darden, and those folks were at NC State. I was there with Mike Brennan, Jamie Rome, Kevin Laws, and that crew. And I stayed for a PhD just because I didn't want to go to a different university and try to figure out which different faculty worked well with each other. Because one of the things I learned real quick is if you put faculty on your committee that don't like each other, your odds of graduating go down drastically. And so Gary Lackman and Setu Raman were my co-advisors for my PhD. And I was sitting around trying to figure out what I was going to do for a PhD project. And that was when, and it's too bad Nate's not here, was when that January 2000, the surprise snowstorm hit. And I remember it was like the models are calling for like 3 to 4 inches of snow. And you go outside and there's 7 inches on the ground, and then they would update it to 8 to 10, and then you go outside and there's 14 inches on the ground, and it was like the forecast updates were 3 inches behind reality, and finally it stopped at like 24 inches, and I thought, man, this was a pretty bad model bust. And so Gary goes to me, he's like, I got a good idea. Why don't you figure out what went wrong in the models? And so Mike Brennan was there with me. And so he tackled it from a potential vorticity perspective, and I tackled it from a sea surface temperature perspective. And you combine those two components into the numerical models and rerun them, and it forecasts you perfectly. And it was basically problem solved. On the sea surface temperature side, the problem was the models were initializing off a 30-day monthly average sea surface temperature file. And if you take the Gulf Stream, the thermal gradient, and average it out over 30 days, it washes out all these transient features. And it turns out during that storm, a warm core eddy had backed up against the coast. So the thermal gradient was really, really extreme. And it caused a lot of frontogenesis right along the coastline, which not only did it spin up the storm even more, but it also pulled the track a little further west, which brought in that extra banding during the deformation zone. And that was it. That was basically my educational career in a nutshell. I got a big shout out to Lynn Pietrafeza for talking me into going to grad school. Otherwise, I'd probably still be wrenching on boats or something.
You'd be catching some of these fish you were protecting as the NOAA administrator.
That was so weird. Like, I was basically brought on as a weather model guy to come in and fix the weather models because of all the stuff I did with Panasonic, which we got to talk about the story behind that, because I got a BAMS paper in the review process right now on it. But I guess just one thing led to another, and I ended up being in charge or acting as head of the agency. And people don't realize how diverse and complex NOAA is. I mean, we're a regulatory agency on marine fisheries side. We have our own law enforcement, and there's all this other stuff outside of weather forecasting. That was literally like 90% of my headaches had to deal with fish issues, because if you try to strike compromise, it results in just everyone being upset. And so that was complicated. And a lot of people thought, well, what's this weather guy know about the fishing world? But I actually came from the recreational fishing world and actually worked a little bit in the commercial fishing side, because I was doing a lot of post-processing of satellite imagery for the commercial tuna fishermen off the Carolinas. So I kind of had an idea of what I was getting into, but it didn't really change the amount of work.
So now you were programming, though, by the time you were, what, 22 or so? When did you start learning computer programming?
So when I went to University of South Carolina, I actually started out as a mechanical engineering major. And our first class, like Engineering 101, was Fortran, and it was on IBM 286. This was before Windows and all that. I mean, it wasn't on punch cards, so
Yeah.
That's my era.
Yeah.
But we actually did have to write
2 briefcases,
we had to write a Monte Carlo program on punch cards just to appreciate how efficient Fortran 77 was on a 286. But so that was where I learned programming. But I changed my major to physics because my undergraduate advisor in the engineering school was, I was more interested in the theory than I was the application. I remember him to this day. I was sitting in his office and he pulls out this switch from his desk, and he's like, "You see this?" Yeah. It's like, I spent 30 years redesigning this switch, and I was like, sounds really boring. He's like, you might want to consider physics or some of the theory behind it. So I changed my major to physics, and there was think at the time there was only like 7 or 8 physics majors in the undergrad there. And so the student to teacher ratio, it was like 3 teachers to 1 student. So it was fantastic.
And so you come out and you start working with a company there on TAMDAR. First, explain what that is to the audience and why it's important.
So TAMDAR stands for Tropospheric Airborne Meteorological Data Reporting. And I was, at the time, I'd finished my PhD. I was at NC State. I was teaching thermodynamics there, 312, and working at a bike shop, and then, you know, kind of trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. And these these people, the 2 guys, literally invented this instrument in their garage, and they tested it out on the back of a motorcycle out in Colorado. And they're like, you know, this is really going to work. We're going to strap this on the side of commercial airlines and collect weather data. And it originally started out as an ice detector. And then the NOAA actually approached them because they did the project based on some FAA seed money during the Clinton Gore administration. And they said, oh, it'd really be cool if you could collect these other data that a radiosonde collects. So they retooled the sensor to do water vapor and temperature and winds and pressure and stuff like that. And then called me on as a scientist. They said, hey, we got this cool thing. We don't really know anything about meteorology. So we would love to know if you can use the data, if it's any good, and you stick it in the computer models and see if it improves anything. So that kicked off basically, well, first of all, getting certified to drill holes in commercial airlines is not a trivial task. And so once those were installed, they were on regional jets, not the majors, because the idea was these regional carriers do 5 or 6 flights a day. So you're looking at between 8 to 14 vertical profiles or soundings. So that was what they were really interested in, is the boundary layer data. And then doing this was at the time that NOAA was running the RUC model. So we did a 4-year data denial study in the RUC model to show the difference. And Stan Benjamin, Bill Moninger, and the whole team out there basically had 2 parallel runs for, it could very well be the longest single data denial experiment in the history of forecasting. I don't know, but it went at least 4 years. And so that was basically the instrument. The big challenge was, how do you get the data off the plane and who pays for the communication? Because you can't use the VHF radio on the plane during ascent and descent, because it's a sterile cockpit, and that's when the pilots are communicating with air traffic control, and no other data can override that. So the first solution was put an Iridium SATCOM receiver on it, and so you can run it, but the satellite comms charges are not cheap. And this is where Panasonic came into the mix. So Panasonic acquired AirDat because they were interested in the SATCOM capability, not necessarily the weather capability. And they were basically running the business. A lot of it was all, when you're on a plane, you go in, you log in to check your email, and you're on the internet. A lot of that hardware is white labeled Panasonic hardware. It gets rebranded, all these different things, but the business model in a nutshell was passengers would log on and pay for Wi-Fi because they want to play on the internet while they're on a flight. Meanwhile, they're subsidizing the National Weather Service to get weather data off the aircraft. And well, that it's still in existence today, actually. It runs through the National Mesonet program.
And that's really cool. So you I guess, is this where Panasonic kind of gets into the atmospheric science side at that point?
Right.
You become their chief scientist.
So they were really after the SATCOM stuff, but then they realized that if you could actually have a much better, higher resolution forecast, you could do a lot of things, from just general aviation safety to intelligently rerouting flights based on fuel efficiency. Avoid the headwinds, find the tailwinds, do things like continuous descent approaches, where you could essentially fly to a top of descent point, pull the throttle back, and glide to the runway, and ended up saving a ton of money on fuel. So it's more fuel efficient, saves some money, it's better for the environment. Basically a win for everyone, but it's all weather related. And so that was sort of where we got into that. But then there was a sidebar project where we were running the GFS, and we started running WARP just to do quality control on the data. So you basically take the observations minus the background in the model, and you take the difference and do the O minus B statistics and use that to quality control the data. So you kind of got to run the data assimilation system, not necessarily the forecast to do it. But then when you start deploying this system globally, do you want to run 20 different WRF domains all over the planet, or do you want to just run the GFS? So we started running the GFS, and we didn't realize it at the time, but apparently the 12Z GFS was a really, lucrative business for the commodity trading market, because that's what swings the natural gas market. And so once people realized there was a private company that figured out how to run INCEP's GFS, they came to us to try to, they wanted access to it. And we thought, well, we can give you a better global model. And the first folks that came to us said, we don't want a better global model. We want exactly what INCEP's can produce, but we want it before they do it. Which is really tricky, because you got to initialize it at the exact same time, because you're pulling in all these observations in real time. And so you got to kick off the run at the exact same time, because you bring in 1 or 2 observations more or less, or even so much as use a different compiler with the exact same code, and you're going to get at hour 384 a wildly different forecast. So that's how I ended up getting into the world of running the GFS. This was back before the housing market bubble and collapse in the early 2000s. But that's when I ended up getting on INCEP's radar as, who's this guy who called us up and asked us for the GFS code? And it's all freely available. It's just no one would be insane enough to go buy a $20 million IBM supercomputer to run it, except for me.
So were you running it faster than the Weather Service was running it?
Yeah, basically. I mean, there's a lot of things you can go into the code to try to improve the efficiency to speed it up. And then there's other things you can do to just straight up outpower it. But my interest was actually, how do we improve it? How do we make it better? And that's sort of where Panasonic, everyone was like, what is this Panasonic weather model? Why is it better? What is I thought they made like flat screen TVs. What are they doing running global models now?
I had one of the radios in my car, when I was in.
Yeah, that was what it got everyone sort of confused. But that was, yeah, a lot of times. So we started running it on well, let me stop there, because this is going to lead into the whole epic conversation.
So give us a little Schoolhouse Rock. I know Kim is real versed in this, but a new administration comes along in 2017. The administrator position is very important. And it seems to me that Barry Myers was put forth for that nomination, and it was sort of a controversial pick, right? Why was he never presented in the Senate, and why did he eventually withdraw?
My understanding, he had some health challenges, and he's doing much better now as far as I know. But I think that was why he ended up withdrawing. It was just, you can't go through a lot of the stuff he had to do to address that and do the job at the same time.
Talk about how you came into that role then, sort of your steps in the process, who approached you, or, how does that work?
So I had done a lot of work with almost everyone in the weather community at that point. So I was doing a lot of stuff with the WMO on public-private partnerships, and really trying to get private industry a seat at the table at the WMO, because I saw everything from weather observations, like the GPSRO data, all this stuff going the way of the commercial sector. And so I was in the world of doing the modeling stuff. And then I remember giving a talk at the Washington Forum several years ago, way before I ended up at NOAA, and telling people in NOAA, basically, like, look, if the private sector can collect all the data, they can run the models, they can produce the output, what are you going to do if like a major company with deep pockets comes by and tries to just do all this? And what are you going to do if they decide it's a better business model to cut you out of the loop? That would be a real problem, because you basically separate the haves from the have-nots, and you put yourself in a situation where the best forecast is available for purchase, not free and open to protect life and property. And the only way to prevent that is to bring private sector into the fold and set up public-private partnerships that incentivize them not to view you, the public sector, as a competitor, but as a collaborator. And so that, I think I was having conversations with the WMO, and I talked to Barry quite a bit at AccuWeather about various things. And he was well aware of what we were doing with the commodity markets and the Sidebar Global Model Project. And I was basically brought on to sort of try to fix all that stuff. People were tired of hearing about the European Center. Why does the European Center have a better model? And and so I thought, this is actually a big scientific collaborative effort, and I figured out how to address it at Panasonic, and I could dive into that whenever. It's actually kind of an interesting story with Bill LaPenta. But that's how I got involved. I mean, I don't really consider myself a partisan person one way or the other. They basically just brought me on to do a lot of that. And the assistant secretary position for observation and prediction made a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And then, when Barry had to withdraw, they were like, well, we're just going to put you in there. You're the acting person anyway. And I thought, okay.
Well, that's pretty cool. So is it a problem that we haven't had a Senate confirmed no administrator since the Obama administration? And what is the Biden administration doing right now in that area? Do you know?
I don't really know. I don't. There's this like cooling off period when I leave the agency that I really I'm not allowed to represent any other entity other than myself back to the agency, which is totally fine now because I'm not representing anyone but myself. And I am working on a couple of papers with various people there. And that's all fine, but I don't really keep track of a lot of the politics and stuff now, so I'm not sure what they're doing. But it's always really good for an agency, no matter what the administration's politics or views are, to have a Senate confirmed leader, because as the acting person, I never knew if I was going to continue to be the acting or I'd be the official. So I never quite could figure out how to properly staff myself, because I had people that were kind of like, well, are we going to staff you? And I said, I think so, but I don't know how much longer I'll be here. And maybe I will, maybe I won't. And there's all this uncertainty. And it was just, I think it was the lack of certainty that sort of kept everyone sort of, just spinning around for a while. But I think we did a pretty good job just in managing a lot of the various situations.
You accomplished a lot during that time. I've been pretty amazed. But some of the best work gets done on the back of cocktail napkins. Airlines are formed, and different cool subjects get mapped out on the back of a cocktail napkin. That sort of happened to you, didn't it?
That is the genesis of Epic, basically. So the Epic is still out, and the award hasn't been issued or announced. And I recused myself from that stuff even when I was at NOAA. So I have absolutely no idea what the decision process is or where it is. But I can tell you how we basically arrived at the plan. And that was back when I was doing a lot of this work at Panasonic. We eventually decided to move from buying these massive supercomputers to going to HPC in the cloud. And we ended up working with a cloud service provider that could provide us with the same capabilities. And it was great, because we didn't have to worry about node failures and all this other stuff. All we did was worry about, here's the code, we can run it in this environment. And the cool thing about it was various universities, I think at one point we had 4 or 5 different contracts with universities funding PIs and postdocs and graduate students to do development work on our model system. So it wasn't just me and my team. We had other universities working on this too. And so people would come to us with ideas to test in the model, and they would say, this is a really cool idea, we want to test it. And the first thing I'd ask them was, have you told INCEP about this idea? And they were like, yeah, but the problem is they don't have enough extra compute resources to test it.
They can't even keep NWS chat running,
They were like, so we're going to come to you. And because we weren't locked into our on-prem HPC with a finite amount of resources, and we call up the cloud service provider and say, hey, for the next 30 days, we want 400 more nodes. And we're going to set up an additional parallel version of the model with whatever experiment whoever proposed to us, and we test it. And if it's cool, we bundle it into the next system. If it doesn't work, at least they can go off and say, well, it's a cool idea, but it didn't work. And they're not sitting around waiting for years for access to to HPC to test it out. And so I would periodically check in with Bill LaPenta to say, hey, you know what, we've been talking to, and some of these ideas actually came from EMC. These, so these are NOAA's own people coming to me when I was at Panasonic saying, we can't get access to hardware. Can we test this in your system? And so I'd go to Bill and I would say, look, we tested all this stuff. You should really think about it. Turning off the vortex relocation scheme was an idea that some EMC scientists had. And we did it for Joaquin and we nailed the forecast. And I don't know if you remember that, but there was a while where the models were just, the ensemble just looked like a complete circle. And it had to do with the sensitivities with the whole Fujiwara effect. And the vortex relocation scheme was actually messing with that. And so we turned it off and it worked. So I'll never forget this. Bill invited me to give a brown bag seminar at INSEP. And I gave the seminar and we were going back to his office and we were sitting on his, this is when INSEP was in that old building before they moved to the new NCWCP. And we're sitting there and all of a sudden the building starts to shake. And I looked out the window and the cars in the parking lot. That was the day that
I was there
hit DC.
I was there.
And I remember thinking, like, what in the world? Like, what do we do? And
I thought it was an atomic bomb. I
looked out the window and we were like looking over in the direction of DC. Like we thought it was like.
Yep. I expected to see a mushroom cloud. I fully did.
And once we realized it was an earthquake, it went from like the shake to like the big waves. And I just thought, for a second there, I kept thinking, how much worse is it going to get? And then it kind of subsided. And so Bill was like one of the people who had to put on the vest and escort everyone out to the parking lot. And so we all went out to the parking lot and we're just sitting out there talking, but they, I was like, I got to get out of here. Cause I was in North Carolina at the time and they closed the airport. And so I had my car. And so I jumped in my car and got on the interstate before everyone tried to evacuate DC. But that was the day that I gave the brown bag lunch where I talked about some of this strategy. And so then we actually had a conversation at an AMS meeting. And I can't remember the year, but I want to say it was a summer community meeting where Bill and Fuqing were sitting there with me. And so backing up for a second, when I was at NC State in 2000, Fuqing was a grad student of Steve Koch's. When I was there working with Gary we were in the Centennial campus, which is the Weather Service office was upstairs from us. And so I had worked a lot with Fuqing in grad school because he did his PhD at NC State. And so I knew him and before he went to Penn State. So it was Fuqing, Bill, and myself. We're sitting around, we had a napkin and he was like, how do we do this cloud-based testing of a community model? And I said, you got to do two things. The first thing is you got to port all the code over to some type of compute architecture that the community has access to. Because the big problem was no one could do development work on the INSEP's GFS code for two reasons. One is the code was like millions of lines of code, hard-coded only towards NOAA machines. So it wouldn't run anywhere else on another machine or another type of architecture platform. The other problem was if you're an external scientist, you can't get security credentials to log into NOAA's machine. So the problem was the code won't run except on NOAA's machine, and anyone who's not a NOAA employee can't log into the machine. So you basically box yourself out of having access to every university researcher on the planet. But you can easily solve it, but it's not an easy lift. Who wants to refactor, 5 or 8 million lines of Fortran? But that's what had to be done. So you got to move all the code over to architecture the community has access to, and then basically make it user friendly. And so they did that. It's out on GitHub now. You can download it. I actually posted a how-to on the map listserv, SUNY Albany map listserv, saying this is how I actually ran. I ran the FV3 GFS on my Mac at really coarse resolution, only for 12 hours, but it worked. And so this was, at that point, that was when I realized this was going to take on a life of its own, because I was getting emails from people saying that they had compiled it and run it on their PlayStation. And so then, that was like the essence of a community development project. And then I thought, oh, we've got this other problem. Now, how are we going to harness all of these people that are playing around with the code? It's like the Wild West of software development. And so so I had sort of designed a lot of this strategy with Bill and Fuqing's input I can't remember what AMS meeting it was, but we wrote it out on a napkin in my BAMS paper. There's a photo. I still have the napkin with me, actually. And so and I'm amazed at how close the real program design matches what was originally envisioned. And that was basically like, you set up this external sandbox that the community can do development work in, and they propose ideas and tests, and then they can go test their ideas because they can run the code. And then instead of coming to you with an idea, when I say you, I mean NOAA, because there's got to be an operational end game. The goal here is to improve the operational forecast system. And so, someone may say, hey, I got this really cool idea and it improves the anomaly correlation by 5%, but oh, by the way, it increases the runtime by 700%. Not going to work. So there's all these different requirements and constraints as you go down what we call the research to operations funnel. And at the high level, these are community ideas tested by the community, proven by the community. And then as you get lower in the funnel, they're more of like an operational code stability efficiencies type of thing. And I would love for the FE3 GFS to become sort of the de facto model that is, taught at universities. It's used as a research tool. People are writing papers, not necessarily that they improve the model, but they use the model to test some experiment or whatever. And that's kind of where we are now. I mean, the code's out there, people are running it, people are starting to, get used to it. The EPIC award, I think, is, whoever ends up getting it, their job is basically going to be to sort of manage this Wild West of community development, where you got to have these objective gates that you go through saying, here's all the different stuff your proposed improvement will be judged by. So in advance what you're being scored on. And you go through that process. And you can even use observations. For example, someone comes up with a new observing system and they want to see if it has impact in the model. Well, download the code, the data simulation system, the whole JEDI front end data simulation system, the FE3 is out on GitHub too. You can test the impact of your new cool observing system in the model too, and then come to us with the results instead of, I should stop saying us. Sorry, I'm no longer at NOAA, but I'm so used to saying that.
Well, should we make a call, Neil? Maybe we could get you back in with these guys. It sounds like they could use your help.
I'm not leaving the weather community, so I'll probably be around helping from somewhere.
But Kim, doesn't it strike you that this shouldn't be a political position? I guess every industry thinks that, or every discipline, but it seems like this shouldn't be a political appointment.
No administrator?
Yeah.
That's, I can see there being pros and cons to it. It would certainly be wonderful to have people who have that institutional knowledge that can stay on. And, like Neil's talking about, how wonderful would it be if he could be there long enough to see a major project to completion. I think that's one of the challenges that this turnover puts into place, is if you're trying to make really substantial change to some infrastructural element of the federal government, then yeah, it's a tough thing to learn enough about. But there's also a real beauty in it, and that you get an infusion of new ideas. So Catherine Sullivan, who was the NOAA administrator in the last administration, was wonderful and a personal hero of mine. I have to say, though, that Neil, it was a joy to see you come into the position and see the fresh new perspective that you brought in, and that was made possible by this turnover that happened. So yeah, there's, as with every choice that's made, I think in federal governance, there are pros and cons, and it's probably the way that it should be, is sort of a balance of those things going forward. But it has been a real joy to see you go through this, Neil, and it's I think a little crazy, because you're so incredibly productive, to think of you as being sort of out there in the world, a little bit untethered right now, but I'm glad to hear you say that you want to stay in the meteorological community, because I mean, it sounds like you could very evenly go for surfing, fishing. I mean, the world is your very literal oyster. So I think we're really pleased that you want to stay with us.
Well, I got to be honest. I did talk to some people down in South Florida about doing working as a recreational fly fishing guide down there, which, you know, I got to admit the money's not great, but
Be a lot of fun.
been
Sign
every
us
day
up,
on the
James.
water.
Right? Let's sign up for that.
Right, he's gonna go Forrest Gump on us and get a shipping boat, and then he'll become like a gazillionaire through some
The captain of the Jenny. The captain of the Jenny. And that's our show title for this week.
There you go. So now, you know, you're talking about the cloud and all this, but Noah's still in the supercomputer business, right? Because you bought a big supercomputer while you were
right. Yeah, that, you know, so the break even aspect of it is, say if you're running something on a computer, you know, and your utilization is 95, 98%, whether you own and operate it or you go commercial cloud, for operational purposes, the cost is kind of a wash. It does take a lot of the liability and stress. So you basically have to put, you're not worried about sysadmins and people managing HPC. You that comes with the cloud service. So I think there's some options there. But then there's also part of the big challenge in the government is, how do you procure cloud? You know, they're used to buying big things and paying for it, and it's buying something and paying for the use is very, it's not insurmountable, but it's from a acquisition standpoint, it's not the way they're used to doing stuff. And so that was a little bit of a challenge, but we're working through that. They need to do like a hybrid approach. And so where I think cloud has its real benefit is on the research side, where your usage actually fluctuates. You may be running a lot of stuff at one point, and then at another point, you're not using it. Or maybe you have a lot of jobs you need to run, but they're not operational production runs. So you can run them at any time you want. One of the cool things about the cloud is you can queue up a job to run at, say, 3 o'clock in the morning on the weekend and get the cloud resources for pennies on the dollar because no one else is using it. That and the research community can use that. If you're doing an operational regular schedule, then you really can't tap into that cost savings. So I think there's going to be a hybrid approach, but I was really trying to push them in the direction of, hey, there are applications that you have that you can run in the cloud, and to the extent that you're not going to impact the mission, go in the direction of the cloud. But you can't just say, okay, we're going to stop doing it here and move it over here. What you got to do is you got to stand up the version in the cloud and get it running very smoothly, get everyone really comfortable with it before you turn off this, which means you're actually funding 2 parallel versions at the same time, which is more expensive than funding either version at the same time. So there's a little bit of a high upfront cost when you're trying to do both, because you don't want to turn off the current way of doing stuff until you're comfortable with the new way. And so I think a lot of folks in Congress and elsewhere understand that that's a necessary step in the process, but nothing happens fast. I mean, to Kim's point, it's like, it took me, I came in already a year in to the administration. And then it took me like another year to figure out what was going on with the entire agency, with the exception of the stuff that my expertise was in. And then you're left with like less than a year to do anything. And so it was a total scramble to the finish line to try to get those accomplishments as far down the road as I could. And so that, they're headed in the right direction, but from their timeline, it's warp speed. I know a lot of people in the private sector will be like, what's taking so long? But, after being there and seeing how it works, I can tell you that it's moving pretty fast, and there's going to be some major changes, I would say, in the next few years that are going to be very impressive leaps forward, both in computational resources and in forecast scale.
So I've got to say, I am so impressed with your ability to take things that are really, really complicated and sort of, it feels like we're sitting here having a fireside chat. You're telling us a story. You've made the modeling community more digestible than I think anyone ever has. And I'm wondering, you're sort of looking at your future now and looking across the possibilities. You have an incredible set of skills that you developed with the private sector, developing these really cutting edge opportunities where people could profit from weather information, and it involved the speed of delivery and modeling systems. And you have this great knowledge of the aviation industry, and now the federal government and its infrastructure and the modeling endeavors that are going on within it. And I can't, listening to you, I can't help but wonder if you wouldn't be an amazing professor. Any student would be fortunate to be able to take a class of yours and just listen to you talk, because you make everything so incredibly clear, and you'd be an incredible resource for the next generation, right? So I've just got to ask, what kinds of things are you thinking about? If you can share, with our audience, what do you see in your future?
Thanks. I love being in the classroom. The best times I ever had in career-wise, outside of fishing and surfing, which isn't really a legitimate career, was teaching. I absolutely love to teach. And really at the undergraduate level. The graduate level is pretty cool because you get to do experiments and you get to write papers and stuff. But really, I feel like teaching undergrads that are super fired up about what they're doing, that to me was really exciting. Honestly, I haven't really thought about it. I had both feet on the gas until the very last second, when I was basically shut out of all my accounts, and I even did stuff on the very last day. And then I just went home and just stared at the wall for like a week. I didn't know what to do with myself. It was so weird. I woke up the next day, it was just already fidgety. And then my house in Durham is really old and it's falling apart, and there's all these repairs I need to do. And I told some folks down at the Hurricane Center I'd go down there and go fly fishing with them, because there's all this. And I thought, I'm just going to take a couple months off and just try to like decompress
right.
from like the most intense 3 years of my life, and then figure out where I'm going to go. And I've just been in the process of trying to recover, I guess, is lack of a better way to describe it.
Oh, I can only imagine that's time off that's really well deserved. Oh, I hope that you have some great times fishing. I'm wondering if the even the weeks leading up to the end of your term were so crazy in DC. Did you ever feel like you were living real life at any point in those years? It's just seemed to me to be a really surreal time to even be in that city at all, let alone involved in this infrastructure. You're trying to do something just extraordinarily nerdy, and there's a lot of distraction around you as you're going about that task, right?
The amount of distraction was unbelievable, and to try to keep your eye on the ball with a handful of priorities with all that other stuff going on was next to impossible. That was probably the hardest thing, but because of everything really being all telework, the stuff going on in DC, like physically in DC, was almost irrelevant to me. I was working remotely. I would go in here and there, but tried to avoid the scene as much as I could. Never really got caught up in a lot of the traffic or any of the chaos. I would ride my bike to work, so I actually had a parking spot in the Commerce building, and I never used it once, except for the last day when I went to go drive in and move my stuff out. I'd ride my bike there every day, which was faster than taking the metro, actually. So part of that is I guess maybe one of the upsides to not being on any social media. I got rid of my TV in 2005, and a lot of people just think that's stupid or whatever. But it was, on one hand, I was not subjected to a lot of those distractions. On the other hand, there's a lot of times that I didn't know what was going on outside of my little sphere of trying to do different priorities. So that was, it was not easy. I'll tell you that.
I bet
I don't think I
Panasonic,
need to tell anybody that, though.
as Kim said in the chat, I bet Panasonic would have given you a television if you wanted one.
Right? Worked for Panasonic, had no TV. Amazing. Was my exact comment. Yeah, I often make cheeky comments off in our chat off to the side as our shows go on.
I know, we're so glad you're back, Kim, so we get those cheeky comments.
Yeah.
When I just burst into laughter over here, Neil, that's what's happening.
Yeah, it wasn't, don't worry. It was not you if you're not following the cheeky comment thread. But I think it's really, really kind of marvelous, actually, just on a tangent about the not having the TV, not having those electronics, the social media. That might be part of how you've been able to be so successful.
It might help all of us as Americans.
Right?
I feel, I gotta tell you this horrible parent story. So I was I've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old boy. And I, we went to a cabin in Brevard, North Carolina for vacation, and we walked into the cabin, and there's this flat screen TV on the wall, and my 7-year-old is like, "What's that?
What? What?"
And I thought, is this like a parent failure or not?
No, that's a huge success. I think the tech companies too are sort of learning this. I was invited out to, of all things, I got to go to Apple company headquarters about 1.5 years, 2 years. I guess it was 2 years ago. I was pregnant with my first, and I went out to give a presentation and and talk with people about developing apps for risk communication. And all the people who I met with were writing just paper and pencil, like there was no sign of an electronic device to be found the entire day, except when I presented, had some PowerPoint slides at the end of the day, gave a seminar. And that I thought was really interesting and very telling. I think that there is something to be said for trying to raise kids a little bit digital free. I can't say that I'm doing a really good job with that. I kind of know the major storylines to most children's shows, but I'll just say I'm parenting in a pandemic, and I don't know how you do it with kids that are the age that yours are. I can't do it with kids that are 2 and a couple months.
That is it's all my wife. This whole time I've been in NOAA, I've had an apartment in DC, and I was commuting back and forth. So she's basically operating as a single parent with a full-time job. She's does a lot of, she's a bioinformatician at Duke, and now doing Zoom school with the kids who have mastered their laptops and Zoom better than I have. Maybe I should teach them Fortran on punch cards.
So talking about
let me just say this. I'm excited, Bill, because
Yeah.
I've learned something tonight. You got the FV3 GFS on GitHub. So I'm over here looking at it right now. I'm going to try and run this thing. I'm going to try and run this thing on my Commodore 64.
Oh.
All right.
I thought you were going to tell us you had a PlayStation.
Yeah.
Run it on.
Yeah, but when will it be on Xbox, Neil? That's what we want to know. But
It may already.
it probably is. But you mentioned distractions, and of course, September 1st, 2019, President Trump, makes a comment that Alabama's going to be affected by Hurricane Dorian, and the firestorm ensues. We're with you the next week in Huntsville, but talk to us about behind the scenes as much as you can about what happened there, because we really appreciated, and James can speak to this more than I can. We were on the front row that day in Huntsville, and we wanted you to feel our support as you spoke to us, and James can comment further about it. But I'd like to hear your opinions and thoughts about what occurred after and during that crazy distraction.
Well, first of all, I just want to take a second and thank you for supporting me and not judging me and jumping to conclusions right away and hearing me out. That was by far the hardest talk I've ever had to give, and probably the time leading up to that. It was the darkest period of my life, I would say. The whole thing was, I was down. I was doing a lot of work with the folks at the Hurricane Center. We were hyper focused on the stall and the turn north and whether or not to evacuate Dade and Broward County. And that was what we were worried about. We were focusing on this, and I wasn't really paying a lot of attention to what was going on in the news and social media and all that other stuff. And so I got sucked into it pretty late in the game, because at the time the storm still hadn't made its north turn, and you got a Category 5 that's literally could be in a couple hours from landfall in Florida, and you're sitting there thinking, well, do you feel lucky? That's how close it was. And then even when it made the turn, then we still had to deal with what's going to do in South Carolina and North Carolina. So this thing was not going to go away for a week or two. And so by the time I got pulled into it, basically, I don't really have a whole lot of background into the lead up to it, other than there was a lot of spaghetti plots being shared, and this is maybe another topic for Kim and social science folks, but people don't understand spaghetti plots. And the story that I think was really lost on people was that the GFS did a really, really good job. It figured out the stall. It pegged the north turn. It was the European Center that was continuing to take it across Florida into the Gulf. The GFS actually figured out the ship first. And there's been some debate on whether it had something to do with the model or these additional radiosonde launches that we started doing further to the west. Could have been a combination of a whole lot of things. And there's a lot of times one model does better than the other, but usually when there's a split, reality is not the average. It's usually when there's a split in the forecast, one modeling camp's right and the other one's wrong. And then you'll see one of the two models just cave and go in the direction of the other one. So there was a lot of spaghetti plots. They weren't even from our guidance. A lot of them were from private industry. And so this is one of the downsides to having publicly available data, is anyone can go get it, plot it, and you don't even know where it came from or whose model it was from. And so the unfortunate story was that it should have been how well the GFS did. And by the time I got sucked into it, there was this discussion of, well, the forecasters are saying one thing, and there's all this spaghetti model guidance that says something that's not consistent. And I thought, the forecasters are paid professionals to interpret this guidance. No one who's not a trained forecaster should really, we don't even, I shouldn't say we, sorry, plot spaghetti plots, because it confuses people. And particularly if there's not a lot of consensus with all the ensemble members. And so there's a reason why there's a human in the loop that is trained to interpret this stuff. And a lot of times, if you can look at the trends in a forecast and say, okay, the last 5 runs, it's been inching this way. So even though this run doesn't say it's going here, it says it's here, we're pretty confident the next run's going to come in and say this. So you can even look at subsequent runs and try to estimate, okay, this thing's not going into the Gulf anymore. It's going into the Carolinas. Maybe you had old model guidance, who knows what. But the question really came down to, well, why does this ensemble guidance that's not even yours is something different than what the folks in the Weather Service forecast offices are saying? And so they were like, you got to reconcile these differences because someone's wrong. And I said, actually, they're both right. The forecasters are right in their interpretation, and the model guidance is actually right if you know how to interpret it. And so my options were basically, and keep in mind, there was a lot of people that are like, oh, you should have resigned over this or whatever. I had basically three options when I got put into the situation. Option one was quit. And where would that have left Noah if I would have quit? Yeah, option two was threaten to resign. And of course, again, you got to realize threatening to resign, you can only use that as leverage if people don't want you to resign. And I was the guy, don't forget, who picked a fight over 5G deployment and its interference with this weather satellite. So I didn't have a lot of immunity, so to speak. And by the way, that whole thing's been resolved, and I think the weather satellites are going to be in a good space. But I didn't.
That's part of lightning round in a minute, so be ready for that.
I didn't really have a lot of leverage to say I'm going to threaten to resign, and they would have been like, okay. And then option three was to stay and try to work through it and figure out how to get the agency to a better place afterwards. So I chose option three, basically thinking to myself, the option one and option two, I wasn't confident would have left Noah in a better place because I didn't know who was going to come after me. Or do you want me or do you want the surprise person behind curtain number two? And so that was basically the basis for my decision. And, I look back on it and there's all these different, what could you have done different or better? But I still think quitting or resigning was probably going to leave Noah in a jam potentially. And I didn't want to do that. There was all these other things. And I thought I didn't realize how bad I was going to get beat up in the press, but I just thought I'm going to hunker down and take a beating and then try to spend the rest of my life digging out, I guess. I don't know. And so going down to Alabama to talk about that with folks was step number one. And that I can remember that like yesterday. I was just scared. I was in a situation. I mean, you had like major reporters are there, and this thing had just like got. I was like, I can't believe this has gotten to the level it's been. This is crazy. But it was just an unfortunate situation that just turned into just craziness in the media, and the Weather Service was caught in the middle, and they did the right thing. I couldn't be prouder of what they did, and I just hated that it got sucked into this. And a lot of people were like, this is going to damage the credibility of the agency. But I gotta say, if you look at 2020 with nearly 100% compliance on evacuation orders, can you imagine any other government agency that can get 100% compliance on anything? Even to this day, 0 deaths from storm surge and the worst number of landfall hurricanes in last year during coronavirus, when nobody wanted to evacuate because they didn't want to go to shelters or anything. That the folks at the Hurricane Center and the forecast offices and the work they did over that last season with having to deal with coronavirus and all those landfalling storms in the Gulf region was just phenomenal. And that fact alone with the compliance on evacuation should tell you how much credibility those forecasters have. No one's questioning their judgment.
And so we were petrified, Kim, if you remember. We get through tornado season and now it's hurricane season. And we were talking on the show about, those exact fears.
It was scary. When I saw the stats come in with a weak La Nina and a warm AMO, and I just knew that it was going to be explosive in the Atlantic. My biggest concern, because we had always had trouble getting people to evacuate, was now you got everyone freaked out to leave their house because they don't want to go. The hotels are closed. You're not supposed to travel anywhere. No one wants to go to a shelter with other people because of the virus. And then you've got to be really picky and choosy on where you tell people to evacuate, because if you blow it, people are going to remember the last forecast that you did. And if you get it wrong, the odds of them being willing to evacuate again drop off rapidly. And so
it helps if you drop a beanbag and the hurricane goes right to it for you. That's pretty nice.
So yeah, I hate, it's a tough thing to talk about, and it still pains me to think about it, but looking back, I don't really know what other options I had. I
You
could
had
have
an untenable
resigned,
position. It
and
was
the thing is,
untenable.
if I would have resigned, everyone would have been like, "Oh, you're like the 24-hour news cycle hero for resigning." And then what happens
Mm-hmm.
next? And so I was thinking long game here, and probably put my career on the line, and maybe, who knows, maybe it negatively impacted my career going
And
forward.
Neil, what did you expect when you walked into that room in Huntsville? What did you think was going to happen?
I I don't know. I got a lot of um, I got thousands of really hateful emails, but they were mostly from people who didn't know me. By the way, I really enjoyed your YouTube video of all the mean tweets you got.
You can relate. You can relate to that problem. You've
Yeah,
been there and you've done that. Yeah.
I can. But I'll tell you what, the ones that hurt were a handful of people who actually knew me, who came to a decision without ever saying, "Hey, what was your side of the story? What was going on in your head? Like, what were you thinking about? Tell me about it." They just were basically blasted me without asking, "What did you think?" But it was, yeah, I was given the option, do you still want to go, or do you not want to go? And I said, yeah, I feel like I have to go. I mean, these people are my friends. They're people I went to school with. They're people I taught. They don't know what to think. Some of them think I've lost my mind, and I woke up and thought, you know what, I don't like the weather service anymore. Or they just, all they know is what they've heard on the news. And so I thought, I got to go down and talk to them, and let them judge me however they will. But if I don't go down, they're going to write their own story and call me a coward or whatever. And so I just sucked it up and went down there. And it was scary. I remember walking into that room, and it was like you could hear a pin drop, and there was all these people holding up their phones, like filming it and stuff. And yeah, that
And
was,
you had media from all over the world in there waiting
yeah, it
on
was
you.
the New York Times. There's all these people were there, and I just thought, they're going to analyze every word that comes out of my mouth, but I don't care. I'm just going to speak from the heart and say what I say. And if they hate me, they'll hate me. And if they don't, they don't. I mean, I didn't really have any other choice. That was it. I was just there to talk to the people. And I had originally planned to be there to talk about something totally different. And the whole thing was kind of a blur. I just spoke from the heart. I remember getting choked up at the end, and then wondering what people would think. And then I remember Kevin being there when I walked in. He was super supportive.
There was
Then,
palpable fear with those forecasters at Birmingham. It was palpable. James, would you agree?
Yeah, no, they were afraid, and I'll say this, Kevin, and again, we're talking about Kevin Laws, who's the science operations officer at the National Weather Service in Birmingham, and he's old college friends with Neil. And he came to me and he said, Neil just looks horrible. I mean, he is overwhelmed with this thing, and we've got to be there for him. And so a lot of us tried to get on that front row, so when you walked in, you didn't feel threatened. And that talk, I don't think you really understand what that meant to the weather enterprise and how courageous that was. I mean, you got the guts to stand out there and do that. Most people don't. Most people would have just quit, walked away from it, and moved on. But what you did is that you saved basically Noah. I mean, you really did by hanging in there. And I hope you appreciate that, Neil. I mean, everybody in the weather enterprise appreciates that. And I'm not so sure we expressed that very well, but it really was a courageous talk. And you're right. You could hear a pin drop. I've been to so many weather conferences before y'all were born on this show. I've heard so many talks, so many keynotes, so many, pinheads up there talking, and it was just an incredible moment. And I don't know if you're going to have another one like that in your lifetime, but understand, people in that room appreciated the courage that you had to stand up there and look them in the eyes. That meant a lot to all of us. So thank you for doing
well,
that.
I wouldn't have done it any differently. I had to go down there and talk to those people. I really hope I'm never in that situation again. But I mean, these are my friends. These are my family. These are people I've grown up with. This is my field, and I felt like they felt like I sold them out, and that was just, and I understand why. And so I absolutely, it didn't even cross my mind whether I should not go. It just was, I just went into it thinking this is going to be rough and scary, and I'm just going to get through it as best I can. And
Now, and I'll be honest with you, this is a good time where you should be thankful that you don't watch television and you're not on social media. If you would be in that world where you're watching television and seeing yourself and your name's all over these, major networks, and then you get on social media and you're just plastered all over there, it is a bad place for your mental health. And I think that was a situation where you should be thankful that you weren't involved in that stuff.
I had a couple of Google searches set up and I turned them off because I just didn't want to see the results. And that's the thing about social media. It has a valuable utility, but it really can lend itself to some really toxic behavior, and because people can just sit there and write and say stuff that they would never think about saying in person, and it really lends itself to a lot of hateful thoughtlessness that, to me, is, I don't have a lot of time or energy to deal with that stuff, and I'm kind of glad I'm not there, not on social media.
And while I've got it, I'll let Bill carry on in just a second. After going through all of this, your advice for the next NOAA administrator, what is your advice? What would you tell that person?
Trust the career folks. They know what they're doing. They want you to be successful, because if you're successful, they're successful. Don't try to come in and say, you should do this because I'm the boss, or I'm going to say this is how it's going to be. And that was never my strategy, because there's an infinite number of ways they can figure out how to circumvent anything you tell them to do. But if you come in and say, I've got these ideas and let me sell them to you, let me convince you they're going to benefit you and benefit the agency, then you'll actually get some traction. And so that was my strategy when I came in originally, was to try to find pockets of people that were sort of really innovative and really willing to take risks, and then empower them with the opportunity to do this stuff, and then go back to all the other people who were kind of like, I don't know if it's going to work, and be like, it's not my idea. Look, see what they did. Look how successful it was. And so so this was some advice that Sethu Raman, my co-PhD advisor, gave me after I went through the whole program. So I asked him, I was like, because I spent a lot of time playing around, not necessarily doing all my research and writing papers. And one of the reasons why I chose him was because he was very, very successful in graduating students. And I knew I had a problem being distracted by spending too much time playing. And so I thought, this guy's going to make sure I get out. And so I asked him, I was like, well, what was your strategy on how to deal with me? And he looked at me and he's like, you need to lead the donkey with the carrot. You can't chase the donkey with the whip. And I was like, you calling me a jackass?
And that's a show title, right?
Yeah. But the thing was, it was more of a carrot-based incentive. It wasn't a do this because I'm your boss and I said you have to do this. It was, here's a really cool idea. Let me sell it to you. Let me convince you this is cool. And then once everyone's on board and they're convinced this is going to be great, you can get stuff done really fast. But yeah, I guess maybe at a really high level, trust in the career folks. They've been there for years. They know how it works. It's very, very weird to come in and think, now I'm at the top of the agency and I'm the person who's been here the shortest amount of time. who am I to come in and say this is how things should run when there's been people there for 30, 40 years, right? There's so much knowledge there that you just gotta be willing to listen to people and talk to as many people as you can, and be open to their ideas. Run stuff by people. Anytime I would come up with an idea, I would sit down with everyone I had access to and just game it out. Ask them, do you think this is stupid? And encourage them to, there's a weird sort of hierarchical where no one really wants to criticize anyone above them. And so I was very, very set on making sure that people felt comfortable coming to me and criticizing ideas, because I would never, ever, the only time I ever really got mad at someone in a business before I came to know it was because they knew of a problem that they were afraid to tell me about. And it turned into a major catastrophic dumpster fire when it could have been put out early on. And so I've always had this policy of, if someone comes to you with a problem, don't get pissed off, thank them, because you don't want to have people afraid to come to you with stuff. And so that was how I like to run things. I would never like to sit at the head of the table. It drove people nuts because I would never sit at the head of the table. I'd always try to sit on the side, and no one could figure out, like, do they keep the chair open at the head? Like, what's going on? Because I wanted it to be a really comfortable, flat organization where people felt like they could walk in and talk to me whenever they wanted. And they didn't want to have to talk to their boss and their boss's boss's boss to say, can we get approval to talk to. I hated when people call me Dr. Jacobs, for that matter. I tried forever to convince everyone in the agency to call me Neil, and no one would break character. It drove me nuts. But yeah, that, trust in the careers. They know, they've been there.
Well, it feels like some trust is being put back in that area again, and I'm glad to see that. James, do we want to have Neil back, or can I lightning round for a minute? What do you think here?
What's the lightning round?
All right. I just had so many questions and so many things I wanted to get to, and I knew we wouldn't get to a third of them, but I know weather satellites are critical. I read that you saved $750 million in that process. How in the world did you do that?
So I got to give all the credit to the folks in NESDIS for this. So this, there are a lot of efficiencies that you can gain with actually having more than one instrument developed at the same time. And there's a lot of, as far as the production process, when you try to run these programs out, 8 or 10 years, there are efficiencies that you can save along the way with various scalability. And so doing an independent cost estimate to try to figure out where you are halfway through the program, you can realize there's all these extra savings. So that was, I think, a big high point. It should be, for the taxpayer, should be pretty happy about that.
You mentioned 5G interference and that it's been solved. That's good news, because we were all at the forefront of advocating for that. And
well, I appreciate the community support on that. I wouldn't say it's been solved, because we haven't seen the solution yet, but the short answer is there's a zone between now and 2027 when the interference restrictions are less restrictive. And then after 2027, anything deployed has to adhere to a much more restrict out of bands emissions. And after 2027, I think we'll be home free. We don't really have to worry about anything, because those requirements are well within the protective limits of where we want to be for the weather sensing. It's what gets deployed prior to 2027 that sort of gets grandfathered in that less restrictive zone. And I think that there was a compromise. Of course, I would have loved it to be more restrictive, but there's a lot of other competing priorities, and 5G is a big deal. And 5G actually is really going to help the Weather Service disseminate a lot of watches and warnings faster and stuff like that. So there is an upside there. There are technical capabilities that a lot of the SATCOM providers that they can do for their base stations and things like that to sort of mitigate some of the interference. I don't want to get into beam forming and side lobes and stuff like that, but there are technical capabilities that they have. And then the other thing that is kind of maybe a bizarre potential upside to coronavirus is there's a lot of supply chain delays. And so I think maybe there's probably a lot of this stuff is going to be a little bit slower to get out than originally thought. And unless that 2027 date moves, which I don't see why it would, I think we'll be fine. And there's a lot of other different satellite observing system capabilities coming on board too. So there's not going to be a shortage of space-based observations. And so we're really talking about one channel. But people don't realize this, but spectrum is a finite resource. And we have to make sure that we fight and protect it for the sciences and the weather sensing, because you can't just, water vapor resonates at a certain frequency, whether you like it or not. And you can't just go somewhere else, because that's just not how physics works. So we got to make sure that we're on top of these things and we protect this stuff, because as much as people love their fast cat videos, I don't think they want to have a forecast blown where their house gets destroyed and they didn't know about it.
Talk about,
when I was like 14, I got a ham radio license, and protecting our spectrum, that's been the biggest deal for ham radio operators, and still is today, because you're right, it is finite, it is limited. And so I totally understand.
Neil, talk about the failure of the advanced baseline imager on GOES 17 and how that got resolved, because that was
that was actually pretty fascinating to me. So there's the advanced baseline imager has what they call a loop heat pipe. It's basically a cryo cooler. So this thing, in order to operate successfully, has to stay at really low temperatures, and during certain positions, it's actually hit by the sun, so it heats up. And when it would heat up, there was a clog or some sort of malfunction in the cooling mechanism, this loop heat pipe thing. And no one really knows exactly why it wasn't working properly, but it wasn't cooling the instrument to the required temperatures. And when the instrument would heat up, a lot of the data would be corrupted. And so some very, very savvy folks in NOAA figured out how to use artificial intelligence, AI, machine learning, to reconstruct a lot of the damaged and missing data, to the point where at one point we weren't sure if the instrument was going to be usable. And the last time I heard, it was about 97 or 98%, maybe even 98.5% of the data was going to be available, which is, it's a couple $1 billion gadget, so that was a major deal, because if you can't fix that, what are you going to do? I mean, it's on orbit, so it's not like you can go send someone up there to tinker with it.
That's very cool. Now, you mentioned briefly in here, I heard the words RO, and we wanted to have a guest about this topic in a few weeks, but they backed out. Talk about it and why it's so important. So RO is GPS radio occultation. So there's these signals that basically get sent from GPS satellites, and you can either send it from satellite to satellite or satellite to ground-based receiver type thing. And the signal actually goes through the atmosphere, and it essentially bends, and you can extract values of temperature and moisture from what they call the bending angle, and assimilate that into the model. And the cool thing about the GPS RO assimilating the bending angle is the observation doesn't really have bias. So you can use it as what they call an anchor observation, like you would say a radio sonde or something else, to then help you improve your radiance data assimilation with your other satellite systems. And there's a lot of different options for it. There's the Cosmic 2, which we launched when I was at NOAA, which, by the way, was super cool. I took my kids to the rocket launches, so that was one pretty cool thing that I'm going to miss, is going to the rocket launches. But the radio occultation data is also available from commercial
there's a couple different companies out there that are providing commercial data. So basically they launch the satellites, they manage the data, and then they sell the vertical profiles back to the agency. And there's a significant improvement from the model scale due to these. And we don't quite know where the point of diminishing return is, because when you increase the resolution of the model, you bring in more data and it continues to have a positive impact. So at some point you would expect it to plateau, but then you increase the resolution of the model more, and more data makes a difference. So, and unless the various frequencies for GPS are potentially interfered with, that is another different observing system that right now really may not look like it's impacted by a lot of the 5G stuff. So it's definitely a really good program, and I'm excited to see the commercial sector and the CubeSat industry really get involved in that front.
So what's the deal with this Russian GPS that's been in the news recently? Is it really a bad thing, or what's the deal with it?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to go Google that. I'm not tracking that.
Yeah, well, that's the only problem when you're watching the news. You hear these things. Space junk keeps me up at night, Neil. But there's some control of that, right? There's like an air traffic control for the satellite junk.
Right. This is the office. This is, a lot of people don't realize that NOAA is in the Department of Commerce, which is kind of strange. I think going back to the whole political aspect of this, there's a lot of people look at NASA and the National Science Foundation and think that NOAA is an independent agency like they are, but it's not so. They're in the Department of Commerce, and there's an upside and a downside, but I would say in general, I think there's a lot of advantages potentially being an independent agency, particularly when you're trying to do independent science. But the Office of Space Commerce is right now, I think it's in NESDIS, but eventually, hopefully it gets elevated to somewhere in Department of Commerce. And one of the things that they're actually really focused on is space traffic management and situational awareness. Orbital debris is a rapidly growing problem, and there's companies out there that are trying to figure out how to collect debris, which is obviously going to be a lucrative business at some point if they figure out how to do it right, because every time you launch stuff, you potentially get space junk, and it stays there, and you would be amazed at how tiny some of these particles are and how fast they move and how bad they can screw stuff up if they hit your instrument. And tracking all that stuff, they're only right now the capability, they can only track down to a certain size. And I don't know what the actual dimensions are, but there's a lot of other stuff that are smaller than that can still cause issues. But there's a lot of potential artificial intelligence, machine learning, and tracking of all this stuff. And knowing where all these things are is incredibly important, because if you're going to launch a new asset, you got to make sure you don't launch it in the path of something else.
Should I be worried about killer satellites, or is that something that we don't have to worry about at this point from other nations?
Oh, I don't, I thought you meant like potentially falling debris or something.
Oh no, those are a whole nother thing that keeps me up at night. But
those will usually burn
satellites
up
from other nations or space warfare or any of this stuff. Where should this be on my list of things to fear between earthquakes, solar flares, cyber attacks, hurricanes, wildfires, and the next pandemic?
That doesn't keep me up at night.
Okay, good. I feel better. Kim, you going to sleep better tonight?
You forgot to put the collapse of society in your list of things to worry about. I don't know how you overlooked that one.
No, I'm living that one. So, that's a good point there. One last thing, because I know James is going to get antsy for us to move forward here, but my uncle single-handedly reduced the population of red snapper in the Gulf of Mexico by about 50%, because I remember our freezers being full of red snapper, and I think he did about as much damage as Paul Prudhomme. But that's an incredible fish, but I hear that fishery is being rebuilt, which is great news for people who love it.
It is. That is a very, very contentious species. You would be amazed. I love catching red snapper and I love eating red snapper, but I didn't realize at one point, the population dwindled to the point where literally the season was one day long. And so a lot of this had to do with just how do you count and assess snapper? It's very subjective because it depends on how hard people fish. It's one thing to say I went out there and I caught, say, 2 fish, and then it's like, well, are you a good fisherman or are you a bad fisherman? If you're a bad fisherman and you caught 2 fish, great. If you're a good fisherman and you caught 2 fish, who knows? And how hard did you fish? Did you have 1 pole or 10 poles, or did you spend 15 hours out there or 15 minutes out there? It's very tricky. And so they actually did this great red snapper count down in the Gulf, where they actually deployed video instruments around and sort of said, okay, well, how many fish are down there? And it turns out that there's a whole lot more than were being caught and being reported, largely because, and this is my personal hypothesis, just being a recreational fisherman, is people use the same online tools to figure out where they want to go fish. And then they go look for other people out there fishing. And so they say, oh, there's a bunch of boats over there. I'm going to go fish over there because they must know something I don't, right? So then there was all these pockets, very, very small, finite number of pockets that were probably being overfished, when the rest of the entire Gulf, the red snapper were just like, hey, you know, everything's fine down here. I haven't seen anyone get a hook in a while. And so that was just, I think it had largely to do with the sampling method, but that was something that was really, really important to the Gulf states because it's a huge industry down there.
China is a big threat to our nation, according to some pundits and politicians and analysts. But under your watch, NOAA was able to uncover some environmental and treaty violations by the Chinese. That seems really interesting. Talk about that for a second.
So that was interesting, and so I've got a sidebar story about that. So there's and oh, by the way, before we run out of time, make sure I tell you the story about my uncle in Alaska and weather radio saved my life.
That's going to be during the sponsored thing in a minute. So hold on to that story.
So we have NOAA has folks down in Antarctica, and I actually got to go down there. In fact, that photo I sent you of me standing next to that instrument was down in Antarctica. So that was one of the 2 things I wanted to do when I came to NOAA were fly into a hurricane and go to Antarctica, and I got to do both of them. But going to that, there's high altitude balloon launches that they do down on the South Pole that basically collect all sorts of different atmospheric chemistry, and CFC-11. Which was basically banned. All of a sudden there was an uptick in it. And between being able to observe that amount of gas that previously wasn't seen, and also being able to retrace where it was coming from, they identified essentially the point source in China where it was being emitted, and pointed it out, and problem was resolved. But that was due to NOAA scientists down in Antarctica collecting a lot of that information. So and it's mostly just a lot of it's used for climate research, but there's not a lot of places on the planet where you can get vertical profiles of incredibly pristine, clear air that doesn't have a lot of like regional, local contaminants, and down there is one of the few places. It's kind of nuts to think you got to go all the way to Antarctica to sample this stuff. But I spent a week and a half down there on my birthday. I actually went to the South Pole and got my passport stamped on my birthday in Antarctica. It was a super cool trip. But I got to tell you, if you ever want to go to Antarctica, be prepared for the medical exam you have to go through before they will let you down there, because it is intense. Because the last thing anyone wants is you to go there and get stuck with some health problem.
There's no urgent care around the corner.
No. And the thing is, the flights, you can't just get all the way to Antarctica and decide the weather's not good to land, so you're going to divert, because there's nowhere to go. So there are times when they won't fly from New Zealand because the weather doesn't permit. I stayed in a hotel in New Zealand for a while before we could get clearance to fly in, and they got to make 100% sure that they can land. So if you're down there and they can't get a flight in to get you out, you could be in some serious trouble.
Hey, Neil, before we take a break, I was going to see, do you know much about this IBM model that they're running here, this global high resolution atmospheric forecasting system model? Have you ever seen this before?
I have. I don't know a whole lot about it. I could be wrong on this, but my understanding is I think it's a global version of MPAS, which is a dynamic core that NCAR developed. That would be my guess.
I'm not in a shop that has weather company gear. We're a barren shop now, so I don't have access to this model. The buzz on the street is not good from practitioners that are trying to use this product. And I think they've kind of, they were going to eliminate their RPM model, but they have decided to keep that running for a while.
Wasn't RPM like Global Wharf or something?
Yeah. It's some kind of a wharf run.
Maybe Global MPAS. My guess is they were, if I remember correctly, that the forecast doesn't really go out that far, and they were basically trying to target a lot of areas that didn't have the short range convective RUC type or rapid refresh or HER type models, say overseas. It's probably a little bit of a challenge to initialize though, because a lot of those areas overseas don't have a whole lot of data to start with.
Exactly. All right. So Aubrey, do you have time for an email segment by any chance?
Sure. How long do you want it to be? 1, 2, or 3 hours?
Since we haven't done email, and people say, you quit doing email. I wrote you like a month ago. So that's the wrong
the Oklahoma
Sorry, if I wasn't buried in winter storms and training.
I played the wrong intro. So while we got a minute here, let's just go right to Aubrey and see if we can dig into the email inbox.
Letters. We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And James, I did get the email on the RPM extension because that's been a big thing with our company. I can't remember the date, but I do know that they are extending it by at least a couple of months now, which is very good news. All right, this is from Aiden Kinzer, WeatherBrains listener survey. So thank you for taking that. We appreciate that and sending it in. Harvey Day Jr. always sends us some great emails, sent us a YouTube link for Weather Nation and noted that there were 15 videos on severe weather safety, which is pretty cool. I did not look through, I did look at the link. I did not look at all the videos, but it seemed like they had some really good stuff there. So that's something to check out, Weather Nation on YouTube. From Isaacs Owen, sent us a listener survey from Indiana. So thanks for finding us and thanks for sending that in. Harvey Day Jr. sent us another one back in February. I can say back in February now. This is from I'm not sure if this is Ohio. I'm not sure what, yes, Hamilton County, Ohio, where the sirens sounded accidentally. So he thought
that's Cincinnati. Isn't that Cincinnati, Jen? Hamilton County?
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
And the sirens sounded accidentally. So let's see. This one is from Leon Matthews. I came across this AP article tonight where Dr. Cloco McLean got a shout out. Weather experts' lack of planning caused cold catastrophe. So thanks for Leon for sending that in. And let's see what else we have. Let's see, from Rob Strecker. This was from February 8th. Our high temperature yesterday was 4 below. They set a new record cold maximum for the day, breaking the old record of 2 set in 1972. The low yesterday morning was 19 below, and the wind chill bombed out at 41 below.
What city is this?
I can't remember where Rob's from. I know he sent us emails before, but it does.
Wisconsin, right?
Is it Wisconsin?
I want to say.
I've got another one from him, probably somewhere up there.
The frozen hinterland.
Yeah. finally starting to thaw out. And that was from at the beginning of the month. Another survey from Brandon Wiggins. So let's see, Brandon's in Springville, Alabama. So thank you for sending that in, Brandon. We appreciate that.
We got to redo that survey. It's terrible.
It's only about 15 years old.
I appreciate them taking the time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
From John Huntington, great episode with Dr. Ugolini. So thank you for John sending that in. And I think that might be about it from what I have. We might have a few more buried in there. But so we do appreciate everyone sending in their emails. And then this one from Jeremy Bauer with the snow, some of the biggest storms in Nebraska. And that would be from the end of January, back when hell was about to freeze over. It was just before it froze. So thank you, everyone. Email at weatherbrains.com. You can send us your links, fun facts, great weather information. We appreciate it. Email at weatherbrains.com.
Okay, so let's take a break. We're going to have Tony Rice and his astronomy report. We'll have Jen this week in tornado history. We'll come back with a weather roundup. Picks of the week. Last week I said peaks of the week, which was our show title. Picks of the week. And a whole lot more as WeatherBrains rolls along. Don't go away.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your Astronomy Outlook.
This Friday, shortly before dawn, look for Mercury about 1/3 of a degree to the left of Jupiter, very low on the eastern horizon. Saturn will also be about 8 degrees up and to the right. This is a good time to look for Mercury because it's near its greatest separation from the sun. That makes it a lot easier to see. Also this week, look for Mars after dusk, a couple of degrees from the Pleiades, a cluster of stars also known as the Seven Sisters. Visible from either hemisphere, just about every culture has a story for these stars. They're even mentioned in the Old Testament. In Greek mythology, the Pleiades were seen as 7 daughters of the Titan Atlas. While Atlas held up the sky, his daughters were harmed by the hunter Orion. Zeus took pity and transformed them into stars. Aboriginal groups across Australia tell of young girls associated with sacred women's stories. The Cherokee tell of 7 boys who would not do their ceremonial chores and only wanted to play. The Iroquois tell of 7 sisters who grew lighter and lighter as they danced and danced, ultimately rising up to the sky. You can look for the Pleiades near Mars all this week. Meanwhile on Mars, the Perseverance rover enters its 11th sol. Mission elapsed time on Mars is counted in sols, or a Martian day, about 40 minutes longer than an Earth day. And that begins with landing. As of today, or to sol, more than 6,300 raw images have been returned by the mission, and they're all available for download on mars.nasa.gov. This includes some incredible footage of EDL, or entry, descent, and landing, from the 4 cameras aboard the rover, the descent stage, and the back shell. Among those latest images is an immersive panorama of the floor of the Jezero crater, where Perseverance begins her adventure in looking for signs of past life on the red planet. That's your Astronomy Outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
This week in tornado history, at 12:47 p.m. Central Standard Time on March 1st, 2007, a tornado warning was issued for Coffee County, Alabama. This included the city of Enterprise. At approximately 1:05 p.m., the tornado was documented on the ground at the Enterprise Municipal Airport. 5 minutes later, the tornado hit Enterprise High School. 8 students were killed when a concrete wall collapsed on them as they huddled in a hallway in a crouched position. Those killed were Michael Bowen, Peter Dunn, A.J. Jackson, Ryan Moeller, Katie Strunk, Michael Tompkins, Jamie Ann Weidensack, and Michelle Wilson. 50 were injured. The football stadium was destroyed and vehicles surrounding the school were overturned. A 9th fatality occurred in downtown Enterprise. 83-year-old retired nurse's aide Edna Hayes Strickland was killed. She was standing behind a living room window of her home as the glass shattered. Damage occurred to an elementary school. A National Weather Service survey showed EF4 damage near the high school and into the northeastern parts of Enterprise. A total of 239 homes were destroyed. 374 had major damage. Coffee County was declared a federal disaster area. The tornado was on the ground for 10.33 miles and had a maximum width of 500 yards. Learn more about this tornado history event at tornadotalk.com. Do you want to learn to analyze and forecast? Join Tim Vasquez at Forecast Lab, airing most weekdays on YouTube, covering current weather, forecast techniques, and random topics. The address, youtube.com/Forecast Lab.
Yeah, many thanks to Tim Vasquez for sponsoring the Weather Roundup segment of WeatherBrains. If you're interested in weather, want to study what's going on in the atmosphere while learning a tremendous amount about forecasting on the fly, check out Forecast Lab on YouTube. It's outstanding. 5 nights a week. So, and not in addition to all the other great products that Tim has. WeatherBrains is proud to have Midland Radio as a primary sponsor, and I'm pleased to announce that next week they'll be joined by the AMS Weather Band as another of our sponsors. We've all been a big fan of the Weather Band, and I was very pleased that they're going to join us and we can promote that very outstanding program. But this week and every week at this time, the WeatherBrains crew is joined by our friend Bruce Jones, the national spokesman for Midland Radio, the key ambassador for NOAA Weather Radio. Welcome back to the show, Bruce.
Well, thanks very much. And it's exciting to have Dr. Neil Jacobs here because in running NOAA, you know, he was overseeing the National Weather Service, who oversees the NOAA Weather Radio Network. So NOAA got their name on the network. And I'll tell you, National Weather Service spends about $16 million a year to run 1,033 transmitters. So $16 million divided by 1,000 transmitters comes out to about $15,000 to run a transmitter for 1 year, or $1.77 per hour to run a transmitter. And James, you know how much radio advertising goes for in 30-second and 60-second commercials. And so to get 24 hours of radio time for about $42 for a 24-hour day, that's a real bargain. And I'd like to thank Dr. Jacobs, everyone at NOAA and the National Weather Service for running this radio frequency-based warning network, because it's important that you have more than one way of receiving these life-saving warnings. And Dr. Jacobs, you mentioned that you had a story to tell about the NOAA Weather Radio.
I do. It saved my life and probably the lives of many other people back in the mid 90s. So I was down at a campsite just north of Sebastian Inlet, Florida. I want to say it was March of 96, plus or minus a year. Camping out at a campground there, and I had my weather radio. It was a brown box with one button on the top and the antenna, and this was before phones and everything else. And on there they said that, and we could see lightning in the distance. And they came on the weather radio report. The automated voice was talking about a tornado warning, and they were listing the towns and the expected time at the different towns. And I pulled out the Gazetteer. If folks are familiar with the Gazetteer, it's like these big sort of red maps, and there's like one per state. So I pulled out the Florida Gazetteer, and I was looking, and I looked at the towns and kind of basically just extrapolated the line, and then thought, oh, I'm next right in this line. And so I got in the van, and I had a couple other friends with me, and we drove around the campsite and basically held the horn down. It was about 10:30 at night, and we're just yelling at people. There was people in tents, there was some people in RVs, and we said, look, there's a storm, there's a tornado that's coming here. You got to get out of here. I don't know where you're going to go, but get out of here. And we left, and we drove south down to Vero Beach, which was at the time the only place I could find that had a hospital, and they had an emergency room. It was like a 2-story concrete building. So we went into the emergency room and just hung out in there. And you could see the lightning and the storm go offshore. And so then we drove back up and went to the campsite, and it was like bare dirt. And I most of the people actually ended up coming back. And so I don't know how long, if there were some people that were able to disconnect their RVs and get out of there fast enough, or what, but it was scary. And a lot of people that ended up coming back were like, holy cow, thanks for driving around and holding your horn down and telling us. And none of that would have happened if it wasn't for, we could have been sitting just out there with nowhere to go. They had some, concrete bathrooms you probably could have run into, but if you're a lot of times you go to bed, you're in your camper or whatever, or your tent, you go to sleep, you're not paying attention to this stuff. That's I look back on that, and ever since then I still keep one with me when I go, because a lot of times if you're out camping, particularly in areas where you're out of cell phone coverage, that's the only way to get the information you need.
So James Van, how many lives do you think have been saved by NOAA Weather Radio over the 60 some odd years? I guess it's 65 years it's been around, and Bruce could tell me exactly how many years, but how many lives you think? Would it be in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands? Well, how many would it be?
Countless. I don't know. But again, we had a tornado north of Birmingham and Fultondale a month ago, and we know that lives were spared that night because of a weather radio. So you hear it over and over and over and over. So we got to get one of these suckers in every house, every house.
And Bruce, the WR120 is the mainstay of the Midland offering. It's affordable, easy to use, great reception. I've got one upstairs. I've got your ER10 right here that I love. It sits on my desk. But you've got a special deal for WeatherBrains listeners. Why don't you cover that for us?
Yeah, if you're a WeatherBrains fan, we've got a special deal for you. If you'll go to midlandusa.com and use the promo code SPAN25, that's SPANN, SPAN25, SPAN25, and you get 25% off all the weather radios and the products and the accessories. And these metal roofs are becoming a little more popular now. I see them out in the country. People put a metal roof on their home, and I'm sure it's very good for you don't get any hail damage and so forth, but it can also affect the cell phone coverage and weather radio coverage underneath a metal roof. So we do have external antennas that you can add to your NOAA weather radio. So if you're under a newfangled metal roof and you're not getting the same reception you used to get, well, there are these antennas available, and you plug them into the back of that white radio, and you'll be back and cooking. But 25% off on those antennas and on the radios. Just use this promo code SPAN25 when you go to midlandusa.com. And here in Kansas and Missouri tomorrow morning, we have our statewide tornado drill. They're going to issue an actual tornado warning, so all the radios will actually tone alert, because the required weekly tests, those now default to silent. So it's a silent required weekly test. But this time of year, when they do those test tornado warnings, that actually trips off the radio. So you do hear that 80 decibel alert tone, and there's no way you can miss out on this. Let me set one off for you real quick here.
That's a sound we know all too well in Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
Upstairs in my house, my wife and kids could hear that loud and clear. So NOAA weather radios save lives.
And I mentioned on the show last week that if you made these discounts any steeper, you were going to be giving these weather radios away. And I had a little lady call me from Coosa County, Alabama, and want to know where her free weather radio is. So I'm going to put her in touch with you, Bruce.
Call me.
But thank you for being here, Bruce, and we're excited about that. Well, we'll do a quick weather roundup sponsored by Forecast Lab tonight. Jennifer Nairmore, have you thawed out up there? We went from meteorological summer to meteorological late winter in the last 24 hours here.
Yeah, most of my snow is gone. So bye-bye. I'm fine with that. And 40 is the new 60 for me. So I'm running around with my short sleeve shirts and shorts, running around in the 40s here. So it's been great, extremely quiet. The storm track is south of me. So I have nothing, no precipitation for the next week. I'm fine with that too. So it's quiet up here in Ohio.
Yeah, we're gonna have an overrunning event the next 24 hours here, and some heavier amounts to the south. I hope they edge up into Birmingham, because we're getting a little dry around here, and everybody starts fearing the old drought word. Aubrey, can you speak? Or are you?
Yep. You got me for about 2 minutes.
Well, what's going on in your world?
Well, we had a nice day on Saturday after some rain. We kind of dried out in the afternoon, and highs were, I think, are in the low 60s. I think we got to 62 on Saturday. So we've had a good dosing of rain over the weekend, but now we finally have a week of dry weather. I'm so excited. It's going to be cool in the 40s, but that drier stretch, we hate to say that, because going into summer, we're probably going to be begging for rain, but we've had a decent soaking the last couple weeks with all the snow melts and everything. So finally, like Jen said, not in the storm track. It's quiet. We're going to take it and enjoy it and breathe and hopefully March is kind to us.
I've driven through the Shenandoah Valley before, but I don't think I ever appreciated it like I did on this last drive. It's just beautiful, and it made me realize why that's a special place.
Yep, it's stunning.
Hey, do you want to do a pick of the week real quick while we?
Yeah, I'll do my pick of the week. So today is the anniversary of Yellowstone National Park from 1872. President Grant, first national park. If I've got the link on there, but if you go to the website and kind of look at the park history, I like looking at some of the old photos that are really cool. So it's more environmentally friendly. And I also want to give a big shout out to Big Storm Brewing in Tampa and Clearwater. They have some awesome weather themed beer. And if you're ever out there, check it out. I have a slight obsession with wine and beer that's weather themed. And they have some really cool names. So that's Big Storm Brewing in Tampa, Clearwater area in Florida.
You weren't reaching for one of those, Kim, were you there?
Cheers.
Well, thank you, Aubrey. It's good to see you. And
have a great night, Dr. Jacobs. It was great seeing you again. Great stories. We enjoyed it.
And Kim, I guess I had my GR Earth set on dew points this morning, and I looked, and I think the dew point in Oklahoma City was 17. I thought that was the temperature. I about fell out of my chair, but fortunately, I think it was in the 50s with a dew point of 17. That's not too bad. We'll take that.
Right. Yeah, we'll definitely take that. I love what Jen said about 40 being the new 60. you know, after what we've been through, it's 40 right now out there in Norman. And man, you can walk outside at a temperature that you used to think of as brisk. But after we got down into the negative territory just a little over a week ago, man, yeah, this feels like we're in the tropics now. So just very excited to be in March. Our weather here has been really, really cloudy. We had this really brief period yesterday where the sun peeked out, and I got a picture of it. My backyard looked so spring-like and beautiful. And then maybe 15 minutes later, it was gone. So I'm glad I got that small window of sunniness. But today and then through the week, we're clearing up and just enjoying this wonderful arc of peacefulness into what will hopefully be a peaceful spring. We need a little peace here. I mean, the October ice storm and then the cold and, infrastructure breaking cold. We could just really use a very small reprieve. So if Mother Nature is listening tonight, I want to offer this I don't know, this peace offering on behalf of the citizens of Oklahoma and the South Central Plains in general. Could we just not do it this year? Thanks.
Well, that's just awesome. Well, thank you, Kim. And we'll come back and get your pick of the week in a second. Bruce Jones, anything going on interesting weather-wise for you?
Our snow finally melted. We had, I would say 6 inches of snow from the cold spell. And, a warm day is good for melting snow, but even better is a warm day with a south wind. And once that wind cranked up, it really disappeared quickly. So we're back to brown grass, hopefully green soon.
Are y'all recovered from your Super Bowl experience in Kansas City?
I don't want to talk about that.
Sorry for bringing that up. All right, well, I'll pivot with you, Bruce. You always have a really cool pick of the week for us. What's your pick of the week?
My pick of the week is this big bad boy. Look at this walkie-talkie from 1976. And my guess is it's probably as powerful as the little toy walkie-talkies we make today. But this was a Midland walkie-talkie from 1976. Look at that button on the side there. Kind of goes in at an angle. And there were, I think, 6 channels on here. So you needed 12 crystals in here. 1 for transmit, 1 for receive, 2 for each channel of the 6 channels on this giant walkie-talkie. How about that?
It probably had 12D batteries too.
I bet it's heavy.
Yeah, that's funny because my pick of the week tonight is going to be from a friend of the show, Scott Courier up in Massachusetts. He sent me an amazing link, and I guarantee you this was in there. Every Radio Shack catalog in history was there. And you can go back to 1974 and see the actual catalog, just like you had it in, we all had them. Yeah. We had the free battery cards and the Radio Shack catalog. I guarantee you that radio was probably in there. So that's going to be my pick of the week tonight. So thank you for sharing that, Bruce. And I'm stalling for you, Neil, because I didn't warn you about pick of the week, but I know you did your reconnaissance on this little radio show that only about 3 people listen to. Kim, did I get your pick of the week? I don't think I did I?
It was late in coming. I did it during the Astro segment. But yes, I have a pick of the week. It is a recently released paper. It's an early online release in weather and forecasting, but it's basically an introduction to what's called threats in motion, basically the concept of having warnings, at least for severe and convective weather that move with the storm. It provides a little bit of an overview of what this could look like operationally, some of the early rules that have been contemplated for it, and what some of the benefits are to the system. So it gives some quantification to, if we move this direction, what could the impacts be on the equitability of lead times for people who are downstream of a storm, and reduction in false alarm area and stuff like that. So if you're able to take a look at that, then please do. It's pretty great.
That is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Jen, did we get a pick of the week from you?
Not yet. Before I do, can I share just a little bit of news?
I know we buried the lead last week, and
that's
we
all right.
Teasing these people, and
I
they were going crazy on the social media.
On the Twitter, they're like, "What's your news?" Tornado Talk is now officially Tornado Talk LLC. I'm a business owner, and it's exciting and I just want to thank you guys, just everyone on the panel and everyone who listens, for supporting Tornado Talk. We have just had wonderful growth in community and folks loving what we're doing. And I've found my boys on there who help me write and do the research. So we're going to be moving into a different phase of our website, into a membership based. We're also going to launch a store, so you too can wear a Tornado Talk hat. And so it's exciting time. And so I wanted to share that with everybody and just thank everybody for your support as we continue to grow. So, and I do have an official pick of the week as well. As part of Tennessee's Severe Weather Awareness Week, the National Weather Service in Nashville is actually hosting a lot of webinars. And so they're doing one that I'll be joining with 2 of my little chipmunks, Nick and Nelson, on March 3rd for the recap of the tornadoes from last year from Nashville and Cookeville. So we're going to watch that, and they're going to do a whole overview of what happened just a year later. I was getting a little nervous last night seeing the tornado warnings over the Nashville area. So, but this is from a year ago. So I encourage folks to check that out.
Outstanding. Well, thanks for everything you do, Jen. It's just amazing.
Thank you guys.
What your projects are outstanding. Plus all your incredible radio work is amazing. So it's time to pay the piper now. What's I know you got an outstanding pick of the week somewhere in that apartment there in Washington, D.C.
Oh, I'm a huge fan and I binge watch your show, so I'm well familiar with the pick of the week. So my pick of the week is the UFS community model on GitHub. So go out, download it, run it, and follow the wiki there. There's very simple instructions. Trust me, I'm a knucklehead coder and I could do it. Take the graduate student test. It's a report back to the folks that do the development work as to how easy or hard you thought it was. And you don't have to be a graduate student to do it. Believe me, I've gotten emails from folks in 7th and 8th grade who now have the UFS running on various platforms. So that's my pick of the week. But I do want to give a shout out, 2 shout outs actually. First one to cooperative observers in the Weather Service. Not many people know this, but my uncle, who passed away a couple of years ago, got an award from the Weather Service for being a cooperative observer in Alaska for 50 years. And my aunt emailed me and she's like, "We got the certificate from Louis Uccellini. Do you know him?"
Heard of him.
Yeah, I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And the other shout out is just to the folks at NOAA. Thanks for letting me be a part of your family. I really appreciate it. It meant a lot to me, and I'm proud of you for all the stuff you're doing for the country and the world.
Well, we didn't get into a ton of the things that I wanted to get into tonight that you did while you were there. And having watched the Golden Globes last night, the only time I don't watch James's channel, of course, is when the Golden Globes are on. And diversity and inclusion obviously was front and center in that event. Talk about this just for a minute, if everyone will indulge us here, about the strategic plan that you developed for D&I in NOAA and some of the other HR things that were really, really important.
So that thanks for bringing that up. So that was something that a lot of people don't realize this, but I had talked to Manson Brown a fair amount about some of his initiatives when I came on board, and then there was this weird period where we couldn't talk to each other for a year or two, and that was sort of I picked up a lot of where he left off, and that was really rolling out diversity inclusion, so the action plan and an implementation plan, and putting in a lot of, and this is my numerical weather prediction hat on, a lot of verification metrics. Where is our hiring? Is it where it should be? What are the demographics? Do we have the metadata to actually drill down into something of white versus non-white, and what's the actual breakdown of the non-white, and making sure that a lot of these underrepresented groups not just felt represented but felt empowered, that they had a seat at the table, that and this goes back to sort of my open door policy, where I had a lot of folks come to me and say, these are the kind of things that I really wanted to talk about. We put together a plan, basically a suggestion. It's like an online suggestion box where people could write stuff in, and it was so beneficial, we just left it up. For it, so it was largely a plan for NOAA by NOAA. We brought in a lot of input from everyone in the agency to sort of put the plan together, and signed off on that not long before I left. And so that's that and a lot of the workplace violence and prevention stuff was something that doesn't really get talked about a lot, but it's something I'm really proud of with the agency. We stood up a workplace violence and prevention program office. If you actually look at the percent increase in any one particular program, that program got a bigger percent increase than any other thing in the entire budget. And I know I'm talking in percentages here. It was a couple $1 million, but that's a lot of money to a program that didn't actually exist. And so we hired and staffed it out. There's now full-time victim advocates. They're doing, and the thing is, it's a lot of times when you go in to run an agency, the people, they know what to do. They're awesome at their jobs, but if you take care of the people, they'll take care of the mission. And this was something that I wasn't aware of. And a lot of times you come in, you're, I'm going to fix the model and do all this observation, satellite and computers and everything. And then you find out there's people that are dealing with a lot of these HR challenges, and they can't focus on their day job because they got to deal with all this other stuff. And so to the extent that you can just sort of eliminate all of that other distraction that's preventing them from being able to execute their mission, do their job, you'll actually improve the mission, because they're not worried about going to work. They're not worried about dealing with all this other stuff that they shouldn't even have to be dealing with. So between that and sort of retooling a lot of the enterprise services, I know you talk to some folks in the weather service about what they think of enterprise services, and they'll just scream and yell because it was sort of a debacle initially. And a lot of that's been retooled, and I think it's going to be a lot more efficient going forward. But again, like the diversity and inclusion, we put in place verification methods and metrics so we can actually go back and look at the data and say, yeah, this was a well-intentioned policy, but is it actually working? Let's go back and check the data. And if the data says it's working, great. If the data says it's not working, then let's go back and fix it. But the problem a lot of times is you put in these well-intentioned policies and you don't put any sort of verification methods or metrics to check, and you just say, well, I don't know why it's not working, or we don't even know it's not working. And that's something I'll probably, a lot of people, maybe they don't think of initially, but that's something I'm actually really proud of, that I think is really going to benefit the agency going forward. But we'll see.
Well, I think that stuff goes as an unsung victory from your tenure in the administration, and I appreciate that. And there are lots of other things we didn't talk about tonight. because a lot of times the administration was probably maligned in environmental circles for certain policies that happened. But there were a lot of great things that happened on the NOAA side in terms of moratoriums and other things that were important. And we want to make sure we recognize those tonight, because some really great things did happen. Any of those really stand out to you that were important?
That the moratorium on offshore gas and oil exploration really stands out, and that's just because a lot of people don't understand what NOAA's jurisdiction is and what it isn't. It's actually the Department of Interior that's the one that issues a lot of these permits. The NOAA would just issue basically an environmental impact statement that may or may not prevent Department of Interior from doing something. But there was this big debate on seismic exploration because they were using essentially seismic testing to determine what sort of natural resources were down there. And there was some debate over what does it do to the fish and to the sea life. And a lot of people that I knew, like in Charleston, the Folly Beach area, the Outer Banks area, these are all places, even down into Florida, where I grew up fishing and surfing. Friends of mine, they were like, what are you doing? Like, what is going on? We thought you were like the guy from the beach who enjoyed all this. And now you're talking about standing up all this offshore drilling in your own hometown. Are you crazy? And so we went through, we analyzed all the information, and the administration decided they were going to put a moratorium on offshore gas and oil drilling till at least, I think, 2032 or something like that. And so there's no point in doing any seismic testing, really, because you're not allowed to drill there now. So Carolinas all the way down to Florida, it's all going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, protected.
Yeah, I look at some of those beach houses along the Alabama Gulf Coast, and there's a giant oil platform right there. That's kind of ruins the view a little bit. I guess it has a place, but maybe not that place. But any further business, Jen, Kim Cloco, McLean, anybody before we end this wonderful show we've had tonight? Well, if not, I would entertain a motion that we adjourn. Troy would have been here. He'd have seconded that immediately, wouldn't he, Kim?
I'll give you your second.
Seeing there is no further business, we'll put show 789 in the books. One of our early heroes in podcasting was Leo Laporte and Twit. And they're only a few shows ahead of us, Kim. I listened to the show this morning. They're like 811 or something. I'm like, gosh, we weren't far behind those guys. But WeatherBrains is the weekly netcast. It's all about weather. We thank Midland. Bruce, we thank you and your organization. We thank Tim Vasquez and Weather Graphics for their support of the show. We look forward to the AMS joining our merry band next week as we talk about their weather band. And we generally record the show 8 o'clock on Monday nights in Central Time. It's a labor of love we've been doing for, I don't even know how many years now. I think we determined it's right at 15 years. Dr. Daniel Welling will be talking about space weather next week. I know we should have gotten into that with you too, Neil, tonight. Maybe you'll have to come back and be a panelist next week. But if you're new to the show, you can access it in a variety of different ways, all sorts of platforms. All of our social media accounts are on the website, weatherbrains.com. If you got a guest suggestion or you liked something you heard or didn't, or maybe even a rant, send it to email@weatherbrains.com. But till next Monday night, for the panel, I'm guest booking weather officer Bill Murray, reminding you to keep an eye to the sky because you'll always have something fun to look at. Well, I knew I was looking forward to it, Neil, and it exceeded my expectations.
Well, thanks for having me. This was a ton of fun, and it's so nice to not have to be like chaperoned with staff and everyone with like talking points, and they're like, "Oh, don't say this." You can say
you can't, as James would say, you can't drive a 10-penny nail up their butts when we call to ask NOAA people to be on the show. It's like, it's like,
oh my word,
that's a saying right there.
That is very good.
That's what James would say right there. I'm stealing it from him, but
they're probably really
Craven was
like,
gonna.
What's he gonna go out and say about us now that we don't have anyone telling?
Right? I bet they were still watching nervously, like.
Well, Craven has been on the show several times, and he was scheduled to be on a few weeks ago to talk about the National Blend of Models. And all of a sudden he got an email that says, hold up, I may not be able to be on the show because NOAA Public Affairs has told me I have to be approved. And so he did get approved in time, thank goodness. And we had a great time with him. But yeah, I don't know where we made him nervous somewhere along the way, Kim, but something we did must have caused that.
It was probably some wayward question that I asked. Just
Well,
being cheeky.
Yeah, your cheeky comment about we could thank Nixon for that.
Seriously,
he did give us the EPA though, right? Was that not true?
He gave us the EPA, but he yeah. He set things up in such a way that there were, let's just say, checks and balances within the funding streams. So on the appropriation side, he pit things against one another so that people would fight. And he stuck NOAA in commerce because he hated the Interior Secretary. So we get commerce. Hooray! What a joy!
Sounds like a whole nother show.
Yeah.
Well, all right, guys. Well, thanks for a great show. And Neil, thank you for being here. It was a lot of fun. And you were a command performance by James. I don't know if you knew that or not. But
it was a pleasure. I would love to come back. I always got more stories.
Yeah, you know the email. Anytime you want to come back, you're welcome.
Cool.
All right. Well, y'all have a good week. We'll talk to you next week.
Bye.
Guys,
Bye, everybody.
so long.
See if they're still on the air. No, they're done. All right, so we're going to sign off WeatherBrains. Ooh, it's that magical part of the show where we simulcast. We are on WeatherBrains Live. We are on Instagram Live. Wow, my mind is blown. Great having Neil Jacobs on the show this week. It's always special to have him on. He was a great guest, great conversation tonight. So thank you guys on the WeatherBrains side. And if you'd like to follow along on the gram, it's SpanWX for Song of the Night. So WeatherBrains guys, thank you guys